As most of you know, last week, the LCB made a public statement that a cluster of farms in Okanagan County had tested positive for the chemical DDE. DDE is a byproduct of a breakdown of the DDT molecule. DDT was a chemical which was sprayed ubiquitously throughout the United States in the 60s. Maybe even back as early as the 50s. It was banned starting in 1972 for a variety of health reasons. And so this chemical has not been used or sprayed since 1972, but it was used regularly on tree fruit crops, including apples. And so a lot of land which was prior orchard land is potentially contaminated with DDT, which has, I understand, a half-life of anywhere from 10 to 15 years. Some of the science folks can correct me on that understanding. And then, so the breakdown chemicals, DDE and a couple of different polymers and DDD and potentially others can remain in the soil for a long period of time. We're talking about spraying that happened 50 years plus ago that we're still dealing with today. So LCB made a public statement and said this cluster of farms in this county have been implicated, and so we've been looking for more accurate information. They have published a map of the 18 farms that are implicated, and the geographic area seems to be very specific to Brewster, Washington. And there's only a couple of properties these licenses and farms have conglomerated on in this area. So my understanding is that not all of these farms have had testing back yet, and that the LCB is bootstrapping off some positive tests in order to have a geographic pinpoint on where they believe the contamination is from. Additionally, some products that have been tested from some farms are testing clean, while others are testing just over the line. So there's also a potential for specific pockets within a farm to be affected and others not. So we're dealing with a whole maelstrom of different tests for different products. We can talk about the LCB communication piece, which I think objectively has been poor to this point. And so we'll have an opportunity to discuss that and maybe have some recommendations for how these kinds of communications can be done better. The LCB initially posted a emergency rulemaking session for this morning at 10 o'clock. And the proposal was to reduce the allowable limits for DDE and DDD in cannabis to 0. And then there's some problems from a lab perspective, with the 0 factor. It doesn't really apply to the way that labs do their scientific analysis and calculations, and so that number is not really possible. Fortunately, the LCB put on hold, at least temporarily, those emergency rules. There were a lot of testimony today about the impact that those rules would have. Certainly, lots of people encourage them to follow the federal EPA standard for tobacco, which is 0.4 ppm. And the 0.1 ppm current standard is basically a catch-all category. So there's 57 chemicals that are tested for, and if I'm wrong on any of this stuff, the lab folks or the scientific folks can correct me later. But my understanding is there's 57 chemicals that the labs test for on a regular basis. DDE and DDD are not one of those. The WSDA lab tests for 243 different analytes of pesticides and other chemicals in their lab in Yakima. And so these samples first came up in randomized testing. And so all of the farms in the state, indoor or outdoor, are subject to randomized testing. And the panel that the WSDA uses is far greater than what is used in the 502 labs. And so that's where this information came up on these random samplings. We have information that the test positive were back to earliest 2020 and some maybe even back to 2018 when they had positive tests for DDE. We're doing public records checks and trying to accumulate that information. And we've also asked the LCB for transparency in making those certificates of analysis available for public scrutiny. And so hopefully they will put forward those toxicology reports and certificates of analysis from the WSDA. So that's kind of a catch up to our current situation. We've got a bit of a reprieve. They're considering what they're going to do, and here's an opportunity for us to come together as an industry, as a community, to talk over some of these issues. I know there's a lot of emotion, so I'd ask folks to do your best to park the emotion and let's focus on the facts and the science, and what we can do to respond as an industry and a community to this ongoing, what can be described as, I think, as a crisis in this industry. I think that we will find that there's a lot more than the 18 licenses that are currently implicated. As this chemical was sprayed ubiquitously throughout the state, there's a possibility that other licenses in other areas are implicated as well. So I think it's really important to get our industry response to this crisis correct. We want to state openly and clearly that public health is a priority, both for this organization and for this industry, and that, but also basing decisions on science, on fact, on information, and making reasoned, calculated decisions based on the facts and information that we have. So that being said, I want to welcome aboard, and I haven't had time to write down all the specifics, so I'll kind of introduce our board members and then allow them to fill in some of the blanks. But let's start with David Gang from Washington State University. David, if you could kind of tell us your position, what you do, and a little bit of background.
Sure. Thanks, Burl. Yeah, I'm a professor at Washington State University in the Institute of Biological Chemistry. I'm a plant biochemist by training. I study the interesting chemicals that plants make and that people find interesting, and some of it is why they make them. I don't do a lot with pesticides like this, but I'm a little bit familiar with it. I'm also WSU's director of our Center for Cannabis Policy Research and Outreach, and I do a lot of policy kind of related things in the state as a result of that.
Excellent. Welcome, David. Thank you very much for taking the time and coming on board, also for talking with us earlier. Your thoughtful advice and perspective on this are really appreciated. So thank you. So we also have Mitzi Vaughn, who is a shareholder with the law firm Carr-Tuttle. And she has been dealing with this issue for a while and has good industry expertise and background in this issue. Mitzi, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, thanks, Burl. I'm a shareholder at Carr-Tuttle Campbell, but I also have been representing I've been general counsel of the Cannabis Alliance and then its predecessor organizations since 2013. So I've been not only in my daily lawyer life representing clients, I've also been advising the industry associations on a wide variety of issues that pop up every now and then. So I have had direct experience with the LCB regarding DDE, extensive conversations, which I can talk about whenever that's appropriate. So I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Thanks for joining, Mitzi. So also on board, we have Lara Kaminsky, who is our legislative liaison and has been previous executive director of the Alliance, one of the earliest active members in this organization and in cannabis policy in the state. So welcome, Lara, as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really just here to try to convey some of the external conversations. One of the benefits of being around for a long time is I've made connections with folks that are in traditional ag, and I have some deep relationships with those folks, including other experts at WSU, in addition to David Gang, and having conversations with them about the actual human health risk, looking at the toxicology element of this. The LCB today mentioned that they had a toxicology report. I don't think any of us have seen that. So getting our hands on that and getting it into the hands of other experts is going to be one of my paramount goals. Because I think, again, at the end of the day, we need actual information, real science. And so I'm looking outside of the industry to start helping to inform some of these conversations.
Excellent. Thanks, Laura. And so, Jill, can you unmute Nick Mosley as well? Nick is one of the owners and principals in Confidence Analytics. I think it's Confidence Analytics.
Yeah.
And Nick, yeah, maybe you could introduce yourself as well.
Sure. Yeah. Nick Mosley with Confidence Analytics. I'm a former board member with the Cannabis Alliance, and happy to be here today to shed any light on the analytical side of the potential implications here.
Thanks. Jill, also Neil Juneja. Sorry, Neil, I butchered your last name. Junja with Gleam Law.
Yeah, close enough. Juneja. Sure, I am the managing partner at Gleam Law, and I testified today, and we're working pretty closely on this issue as well. And I'm sure my reputation precedes me. So if there's any questions, feel free to ask someone.
Great. Yeah. Am I missing anyone? Thanks everybody for joining. We want to bring Mike on as well. Jill, can you? Yeah. And then we've got Micah Sherman from Sun and Craft Growers. Thanks, Micah, for joining. Can you give a brief introduction for yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. Micah Sherman. I own and operate Raven. We're a small farm in the Olympia area. And I'm, like Earl said, I'm also on the board of the Sun and Craft Growers. And another thing that we're involved with at the Sun and Craft Growers is with the National Craft Cannabis Coalition, which is a coalition of trade groups at the state level that represent predominantly craft growers. And that organization is a part of the Parabola Center. Partner with that organization, which I believe the Cannabis Alliance might be as well, but I'm not sure about that. And I just wanted to highlight one of the things that I spoke to in the board meeting today was a disinterest from making comparisons to us and tobacco. And that's something that the Parabola Center is highlighting right now as part of their anti-monopoly toolkit. And that's about making sure that the cannabis industry doesn't become dominated by the tobacco industry. So I think it's an important thing to highlight again in this conversation, that making that clear separation, that we do not want to go down the road of the way the tobacco industry approached these sorts of issues.
Thanks, Micah. I really appreciated your testimony today before the LCB and raising that issue. I think it's important to pay attention to federal standards, but the cannabis industry is very different than the tobacco industry, very different in motivation and how it came to be, and in its small business nature. So I agree not to make the cross parallels to tobacco, but also understanding that federal standards for pyrolyzed inhalants have been set for tobacco as well. So it's important to have at least parity from a regulatory perspective without necessarily going down the road and becoming like tobacco, which certainly as cannabis we do not want to do. David, maybe I can start with you and kind of let's kind of talk about a scientific background. I gave a layman's sort of understanding of DDT and DDE. Maybe you can give us sort of a better background and scientific understanding of those molecules.
Okay, sure, real quick. They were, DDT is probably the most effective insect controlling compound that's ever been discovered or invented by humans. It was wonderful. It eliminated malaria around the planet. It did all kinds of great things, but it also had some bad side effects when it was broken down into other compounds like DDE. There's a lot of controversy about what those side effects are, how legitimate the claims are. At this point, it doesn't really matter. It's a regulatory issue. But what the big thing that it was targeted for originally for its elimination was the potential impact on raptors, like falcons especially were affected, and golden eagles and things like that, that there was a diminished thickness of the eggshells. And so there was a concern that they were, causing the decline in the raptors. So that's what was the impetus to get rid of it. As you mentioned, Burl, the half-life depends on the soil and the environment. It's 2 to 15 years, depending. It was banned in the early 70s. So we've gone through many half-lives, but it was used very heavily in a lot of places. It works great on mosquitoes, on fruit flies, on all kinds of flying insects, especially. But so that's why it was very, very used, so very widely used. The breakdown product that is most concerning, I think, is the DDE. There's some suggestion that it has some endocrine receptor interference activities that might affect people. Again, it's one of those questions of how, what kind of data is there to support that? There's some papers have claimed that, others have said that maybe that isn't really real. Again, it's a regulatory thing. The half-life on that molecule is a lot shorter. It's like a couple of hours out in the air. So but thing is, it has to reach the air to be exposed and then broken down. So if it's in the soil, UV light isn't going to hit it. It's not going to get broken down. The plant cannabis sativa in whatever form, whether you're talking high THC cannabis or hemp or whatever, it's a very effective soil remediating plant. It pulls lots of compounds out of the soil. It's quite well known for that. One of the good things about it and one of the bad things about it, right? Depending on what your downstream application is going to be. So it tends to hyperaccumulate some compounds, and apparently this is one of those. We don't really know. The compound hasn't been tested for widely, as far as I'm aware, in the state. I haven't really heard about it in years until this popped up this year all of a sudden. It's been kind of like under the radar, not really a concern. It doesn't seem to affect the tree fruit industry as far as we know, but we don't really know other vegetables. It's not tested for really in a lot of them. So I just, it's popped up here as an issue. We don't know what the impact is going to be on the rest of the ag industry as a result of this. There's a potential, rollover into other things. And now all of a sudden we say, oh, these regions have a problem with it. So now anything that's grown in that area might be, quote, contaminated. That's a significant concern, I think, and what that's going to be to the whole broader ag industry. I think the ag industry needs to be aware of the situation and might be rightly concerned as well. And I agree with the comments made earlier that I think that there are a couple of federal agencies, the FDA and the EPA, that are ideally suited to be the regulatory agencies for these things. I think LCB is kind of way out of their wheelhouse. They don't have expertise in this area. They really ought to rely on the experts in the world to tell them what to do here, in my opinion. But they're going to do what they're going to do. So I wasn't able to hear that meeting this morning. I'm going to see if I can listen to it later. But I'm glad for your short comments on that, Brill, to tell us about where that is, that they're going to hold off on that. But yeah, when I heard that it was basically zero tolerance for it, that's, to be honest with you, any one of us that has any fat in our body, which is probably the vast majority of us, if you were to take a biopsy of that and run it on one of my instruments, I have LCMS instruments that are really sensitive in my lab at WSU. If I set it up to measure this, I could probably measure DDE out of you because it's so widely, in the environment, it's everywhere. We've all been exposed to it our whole lives, basically. So I don't know what the levels are that really matter to us. I think we don't know the answer to that. And saying that you got to go down to zero nobody does that. No regulatory agency does that for anything.
Yeah.
So I'm glad they decided to hold off on that. They really need to rethink that, in my personal scientific opinion. But
well, that's great, David. And
along with anything else that's been done. Sorry, go ahead, Burl.
Oh, I was just going to say your personal scientific opinion carries weight. And so it's important to communicate that opinion to the board. They're open to written testimony. So they didn't do a lot today. They just basically said, hey, we're not going to vote on this now. They are going to meet with stakeholders. They're going to meet with trade organizations. They're going to meet with the licenses that are implicated, and hopefully they're going to meet with the scientific community as well to try to gain as much information as possible before they make a ruling. I certainly encourage them to take the federal standard, and hopefully they do that. And so, Nick, one of the things that we've talked about before in a couple of different things under the THC bill as well, when they were looking to bring things to zero, David's raised a really good point. Can you talk a little bit about the 0 point and limit of quantification, what labs can and cannot test to, and what your standards are?
Yeah, somewhat surprising. I mean, I think LCB's kind of been beaten over the head with this over the years. And in fact, I think Nordhorn was testifying to the Senate this session about why a zero tolerance is difficult to implement. So kind of surprising that they came out with this in their own rules. In my experience, dealing with zero tolerance limits, I mean, as you said, the lab can't test down to zero. We can only test down to some number that may approach zero, but never can get down to it. That said, there is precedent for a zero tolerance. So for example, my lab operates also in California. For class 1 residual solvents in California, there is a zero tolerance. The way that gets implemented as a practical matter is the labs are held to a minimum limit of detection. So we have to demonstrate through our validation that we can at least test down this low. If we test down lower and we detect something, it's still a fail. But we have to demonstrate that we can at least go this low, which is all a lab can really ever do.
Excellent, thank you. And so, again, this is not a chemical that gets tested for by any of the certified 502 labs. This is not part of your regular pesticide panel of testing. Can you speak a little bit to what it would take if you were to implement this standard for DDE or DDD? What is required by your lab to be able to bring that standard online?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important point. The operators in 502 are put at a pretty serious disadvantage here because, so far all of the testing has been done by WSDA, and the operators themselves haven't had an opportunity to really experiment and see what is possible here. For example, it's been speculated that because DDT has a very high boiling point, much higher than THC, that perhaps the distillation process has been clearing this out. We know that these particular farms that are affected, a lot of their material goes to distillate. And so it may be that just along the way, the industry has been naturally distilling out this compound. But we don't know that because as private operators, we haven't had an opportunity to investigate. So yeah, obviously, our lab, jumped at the side of it. Like we need to help the industry have access to the testing. What is it going to take? It starts with, we obtain standards. We see how these new compounds, I mean, really we're looking at 5 compounds. Internally, we're referring to it as DDX because it is DDT, DDE, DDD, and there are also 2 isomers of each. So we're really looking at a handful of chemicals that we're now trying to add to our method.
But we don't know because we haven't gotten anything official from the LCB.
We don't, right? And so we're really, at our own expense, and at quite extensive effort, we're trying to make available to the 502 community access to information that could at least help the operators understand where they stand, and what their remediation opportunities might be, or to what extent it's even necessary.
Excellent.
So, it can be a 2, 3, 6 month process. Optimistically, this happens in a matter of weeks, where we can at least provide a screening method. But yeah, I mean, I think that's, optimistically, it's a matter of weeks. Potentially, it's a matter of months.
And I just wanted to jump in here real quick because I did have a conversation with WSDA yesterday after the emergency rule draft came out, asking, what their understanding is of how, testing would occur. And they were very clear that only they had the lab capabilities at this time, and they would not be able to do all the tests. So, again, misguided timing at minimum. But yeah, if this becomes something that's part of permanent rule, then, obviously we need to make sure that the industry can comply.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura. And so Amber Wise has joined us as well from Medicine Creek Analytics, and Amber chimed in briefly. Jill, if you could unmute Amber, just to let everybody know again for panelists, if you can stay unmuted, because it requires Jill to unmute you. I recognize everyone's got their Zoom controls and they want to mute again as soon as they made a comment, but if you could kind of remain on the line. So Amber, thanks for joining us. I know that you were involved in another meeting and joined us late. Can you just give us a little bit of a background on you, a quick CV and just introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, thanks, Burl. I actually did some postdoctoral research on pesticide degradation in the environment. And I look at these numbers and I don't panic. I mean, this is kind of part of living in society. I don't want to suggest that it's fine and wave it under the carpet, but I don't see these numbers and think public health crisis. Step one, it's part of my CV. Then I was a chemistry professor, and then I've been in the cannabis industry now for over 6 years and running Medicine Creek Analytics now, as most of you know, for over 4 years. So as Nick mentioned, we're on it. It's going to take a while. I'm going to try to get an update on our website about where we're at, so people don't have to constantly call and check. But it's not going to be fast. All of the reading I've been doing is it might be a completely separate prep and a separate test. We might not be able to throw it on the same method we currently have. I don't know. So
Right.
Anyway, everything Nick said is true in terms of timeline. It's going to be a while, and we're doing our best. I think there's only a very small handful of labs, if not 2, that have this instrumentation. So I would love to hear from the LCB how they plan to, accredit people on these methods. Nick and I had a conversation yesterday, and I'm going to ask for an extension on our RJ Lee paperwork, which is due in a couple of weeks, and ask to submit all of our paperwork when we get this method done so they can accredit us at that time. I want to be transparent with people where we are with the method. I have yet to hear an action limit, like Nick was saying, or a limit of detection that we have to meet. I don't even know if we can meet that limit yet. So, we'll do our best, and I'm here to answer other questions, I guess, as people have them.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I encourage the LCB to work with both of your labs specifically, and also to provide funds for you to spin up your methods, because I recognize that that's a cost to you as a lab to try to get that up. If you have to do a completely different method, I would imagine that that's going to come at a significantly additional cost if you've got to run a specific test that's not within your ordinary pesticide panel. Oh, Jill, can you unmute Amber again? She muted herself out.
All right, I'm going to try.
You're such a good Zoom participant.
I will, thank you for that comment. I actually logged off that meeting this morning and someone mentioned that you brought that up and I appreciate that. But you know, I'm not holding my breath for funding, but it is nice to be acknowledged that this was dumped on us, you know, as it was dumped on everyone. And, you know, I mean, we're running this machine almost every day for regular pesticide testing. Like, when am I supposed to develop a new method that's completely separate? We'll give it our best shot.
Yeah, and is this a gas spec? What's the specific piece of equipment that's required?
Yeah, it's a GCMS, gas chromatography mass spectrometer.
Okay. GCMS, and I understand that you guys
MS actually, technically.
Okay. And I understand that your two labs are basically the only ones that have this piece of equipment.
Don't quote me on that because I don't know for sure, but that's my general understanding.
And ultimately, I'd love to see all of the labs in the state come up to this, and that's another thing that I raised. Ultimately, we'd like to have them all on board, but for right now, the two labs that are capable of running these tests should be receiving emergency funding, both for manpower, any equipment, the standards that you need to purchase to develop your method, and certainly the time involved in doing that, so we can get you up and running as quickly as possible to provide what's required. So ultimately, I appreciate that the LCB has done administrative holds, but we've basically got to be able to test every batch of cannabis products that are coming out of those areas or basically any areas in order to determine whether or not they're contaminated with this chemical, once we figure out and set the action limits and the detection limits. I think that's critical. A really good point was raised as far as distillation. The heat of distillation might break down. Certainly, a lot of these farms are providing bulk crops that are then going for extraction and ultimately turned into distillate and other oil products. And so we need to understand, where that material has gone, and to the extent that any contamination is there. And I also encourage them to focus on testing shelf-ready products. So there's no point testing the fan leaf of a growing plant out in the field when that fan leaf is never going to see never going to see the pipeline of cannabis products. It's important to test dried, cured, trimmed products and or the resultant oil and other products that are created for them. There's no point doing soil and water testing if that chemical is not present, in the ultimate products that go to consumers. So hopefully they can hear that message as well and really focus on testing products that are at a consumer ready level. I would also love to see some remediation involved. And I know remediation is kind of a dirty word, but essentially when we're talking about parts per million and parts per billion, often under these circumstances, there's an old saying that the solution to pollution is dilution, and that simply aggregating some of these batches together so that the consumer product is below the action limit would be sufficient. Does anybody kind of want to comment on that?
I can comment on it, excuse me, from a legal standpoint, because I actually have had these conversations with the LCB back in 2020 about DDE specifically. Extensive conversations, high up conversations, and I think maybe there's a lack of institutional knowledge kind of going on here a little bit. But at that time, we talked about product testing because they weren't testing what the consumer was actually having. And in the end, they did test the end product and there was a non-detect. So that is experience that has occurred. And I just kind of want to throw in, because this was in 2020, I was really surprised by the emergency nature of this whole thing, because this is not new. I'm not a scientist, and I know this is not new. DDE contamination is, if you deal with ag, that this is out there. And so I feel like the way perhaps the LCB handled it, although, wanting to protect public health, was not only, it was a little overhyped. And so I feel like also the industry is reacting to that tone and feeling like this actually rises to that level. And just based on my experience, not on the science or anything else, this has been trucking along for years and nobody felt like it was a huge emergency before. So.
Yeah, I have to echo that. This I've known about this chemical in cannabis dating back to 2020 as well. I think some of the reports that we've gotten, I've submitted a public records request which hasn't been fulfilled yet, so I can't speak to some of those prior tests. But certainly Jim McCrae was talking about tests going back to 2018 that were positive for DDE. So we can assume that this chemical has been in cannabis products since the initiation of 502 and before. And so I was kind of careful to write down some of the numbers that Chandra Wax was indicating were positive. I've asked the LCB to make all of the C of A's from the positive DDEs public, redact whatever information needs to be redacted, but make those C of A's public so people can see. So the numbers she was talking about were 0.19, 0.17, 0.23, 0.15, 0.18, 0.23, 0.14. So we're talking about, barely over a line that wasn't set for any scientific reason. So the way I described earlier, the way the LCB set their standards for stuff in cannabis was anything over 100 parts per million or 100 parts per billion, 0.1 parts per million was not allowed except for the 57 specific chemicals that they set levels for. So there's no kind of science behind 100 parts per billion that says, oh yeah, as soon as you get 120 parts per billion, you're in trouble, but 100 parts per billion is fine. So, again, I think we need to look to those federal standards and follow the science and try to figure out where the ultimate limit should be for this chemical that, frankly, is on a lot of the foods that are in our grocery stores. And like David said, we've all been exposed to it at whatever level at this point. It was so ubiquitously used. Even when we were talking to Postman, initially when this came up, he said he can remember being a kid and them spraying DDT, all over the fields, and they were getting spray on them as they were kids out playing in the field. So, certainly the exposures that we're talking about are well less than that. But I think it's important to follow the science and really pay attention to this stuff. But the idea that all of a sudden we have an emergency situation, all of a sudden, because we had samples that were taken in August of last year, WSDA had them in September. They had a backlog, so we had reports back as early as February of this year, and then this action without consultation, without collaboration or communication, to put 18 licenses on administrative hold when they hadn't even tested all of those licenses and all of the products out of those licenses, is obviously raises some very difficult legal concerns. Mitzi, thanks for jumping in on that. What do you think are more of the sort of legal ramifications of the actions that the LCB have taken at this point?
Well, it's tough, to be honest with you. An agency's discretion over something like pesticides, where you have a health and human safety issue just inherent in the word pesticide. Everybody hears pesticide and kind of doesn't understand how ubiquitous this actually is, or other pesticides are, on things like what you eat. So from an administrative law standpoint, it's very difficult to particularly force the Liquor and Cannabis Board to do anything different. So that's just as an agency. I've heard, and I'm sure everybody has, a lot of talk about litigation And litigation is long, difficult, and it's 50 times more difficult when you're trying to sue the state. So what in conjunction with my work with the Cannabis Alliance and just talking to clients as well, that emphasis, I feel from a legal standpoint, should be top down in really trying to discuss this with the legislators who oversee the LCB, with the governor's office, with the actual LCB board members, which was what occurred this morning in the board meeting, because that's how this is going to get done the quickest, if at all. And right now, instead of kind of revenge, right, a lot of people just are mad, and it's completely understandable. I can't even imagine what it's like to be going through this for the affected licensees, but getting relief is what legally I think we should be, full court pressing on, and then deal with the damages, right? In law, you're trying to mitigate your damages, right? And that's what we need to do right now as an industry, is try to reduce the legal impact, the financial impact of what's happened. And then kind of once it's sorted out, then look back and figure out if anything can be done to redress those wrongs.
Micah, do you want to talk a little bit about the impact to the farms? I know you've been in touch with a few of the farms. If we've got any representative from the farms on board, raise your hand and let us know who you are. We're going to throw it open to questions and comments from the public as well. So if you have questions or comments, throw them in the chat, and we'll try to get to people. But Micah, maybe you can just kind of speak about we heard a lot of compelling testimony today from some of the farms. Maybe you could speak to the impact on the farms a bit.
Yeah, so none of our members were directly impacted. So I haven't had any direct conversations with any of the 18 licenses myself. So I can really only speak to the sort of secondary impact it's had on other farms in the Okanagan area. The initial communication from the LCB used the term region to describe like a sub area within the county, which I think was a really bad language choice. Like, it made people think on a much broader geographic scale than they were really talking about. So I think that was sort of the first big impact, was basically anybody that was in the Okanagan area was sort of initially kind of wrapped up in this, and there was a lot of lack of clarity about what they meant by that term. So we got a little bit of conciliation from the LCB on that issue, and they are being more circumspect with how they describe the sort of localized impact of this. So that has been an improvement and something for us all to sort of take note in when we talk about the issue. Like, describing it in a broad region isn't necessarily the best way to describe what's going on. And so we've definitely seen farms in that area, have orders put on pause and have to do a lot of extra work with their retailers to sort of explain without a lot of information about why it's okay for them. And so they're definitely put a lot of pressure on farmers to be talking about something in a really reactive way without all of the information out in public. And I think that was a really irresponsible way for them to have handled it. And I think if we had an agency like the Department of Ag that was running the show in regards to this situation, we would have seen a lot different of a response, and there would have been a lot more clarity before the press release went out. I think we see a desire to be seen as taking action to preventing people from being harmed without there really being substance to the action having actual impacts in the real world that prevent people from being harmed. So I think that was the real issue with this whole thing, is this was more about the perception of the situation than the reality on the ground. And I think that was frankly irresponsible, and I'd like to see that make sure that is clearly broadcast, that basically no one really knew what was going on when that first bit of information went out, and it put everybody on the back foot of having to respond and defend themselves without really understanding the situation sufficiently to be doing that. So, you know, I sourced some of my product from a farm in Okanagan and felt that same issue of not really being able to substantially respond to the situation with the clarity that it deserved because the LCB acted brashly. And so I hope we can all sort of learn yet again to take with a grain of salt what comes out on a LCB email, because it's not always well vetted. And you know, I hope in the future that's not the case, and we learn from this experience. But I'm not going to hold my breath.
Yeah, well, I was glad that they took a moment to take a deep breath and consult with people before coming down with an unrealistic, unscientific standard today. And hopefully they will, you know, take the science into consideration in making their decision and actually collaborate, talk to stakeholders, talk to experts, and come to a reasonable decision. David,
I want to interject
Go
one
ahead.
thing there too. Is I really just want to express appreciation for the board themselves, the 3 board members who listened to everything that everybody had to say, told their agency that they weren't going to move forward with the plan that was presented to them. And that was very unusual. And I was surprised that happened. That was not what I was expecting out of that meeting. And so that is, you know, something substantial that we should all appreciate. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in that moment, because that is not how they've behaved historically.
agreed. This is a really good learning experience. I was gratified to see that decision announced early on in the meeting, and that you know that we're actually talking about collaboration and having a conversation and trying to get to the right result. That's where it should be, and the, you know, the era past of swooping in like cops and you know, trying to find robbers, hopefully is a thing of the past, and hopefully, you know, as an industry, we can get treated like adults and have a conversation and indeed protect the public health, I think, better under those circumstances. David, I wanted to go back to you. The question came in the chat, and it was one that I had as well. Is there any scientific evidence or studies done around inhaling and pyrolyzing and inhaling these products, like in tobacco, versus you know, what's available in the food chain? Are you aware of any studies being done around that?
That's outside of my area. I don't know.
Okay.
So I don't want to make a comment about that either way when I don't know.
Right. Yeah. I think it's an area that
tobacco. I don't. It's not my area. So yeah.
Yeah.
Could look into it, but
I appreciate it. I think that's going to be a big question as we go forward. Is, you know, is there an increased danger through pyrolization and inhalation versus you know, consuming and absorbing through mucous membranes, or, you know, any other manner of consuming these products, whether that makes a difference. So kind of important to know. I'm going to try to dig in myself and see what I can find in that area, and certainly would be good information for the LCB to have as they make their, you know, decision on where that standard should end up. Neil, you had some
one thing I
can
say real quick on that is,
yeah.
you know, Google Scholar search pulls up that people have looked at this. So there are papers that have been published. I just have not read those in any depth, so I don't know what the answer is. So it has been looked at, but I don't have the answer to your question about what that connection is.
Excellent. You got everybody here going on Google Scholar right now.
Everybody's going to go look for it. Yeah, there's a bunch of papers that pop up. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Neil, you had some good comments this morning with the LCB. I wondered if you wanted to kind of talk about some of your points this morning.
Sure. Where did the notes page go? I swear my desk was very clean when I walked in this morning. Jesus. So effectively, if I'm going from memory, it really does seem like a unilateral emotional result as opposed to looking at any of the scientific data, especially when they've had these tests for a while. Hey, there it is. But some of the other items I went over was the fact that Okanagan is the breadbasket of cannabis. So going after the farms or just looking at the soil is irrelevant. And since we're producing so much cannabis out of these farms, it's in every edible, it's in a lot of the extracts. We're talking about decimating the cannabis industry as a whole if they proceed with this without any scientific backing. And I really believe there's not a whole lot of scientific backing on a random 0.1 ppm for all pesticides without any looking into that, without any investigation into that. We did try to get those results, and enforcement flat out hung up on us, would not provide the data to support the holds that were offered, which is extremely suspect that we don't have any of the actual supporting documentation for the moves they're making right now. They told us to file a public record request, which is absolute BS, considering you're lucky to get anything in 30 to 60 days. And at that point, you put everybody out of business. And then I was just, I was out of the country and I was meeting with some other law firms, and this is well known of. And I think it's really an issue when we are the first state along with Colorado. We're either a guidepost to how we do legalization of cannabis at a national or a international level, or we're a speed bump on the road on how to do it wrong. So, you know, we're the stewards of the future of cannabis. So I think it's really important that we do get this correct, or at least not unilaterally make immediate moves that decimate our industry as a whole.
I agree with you. I thought that was a really important point. You know, Washington is the center of cannabis for a lot of the world, and the eyes of the world are upon us. And it's important for us to get this right. And so I'm glad we're taking some extra time. Hopefully, the comments will be considered and accepted, and hopefully we can get to you know, the best possible solution rather than the quickest possible solution. So,
can I interject something on that point, please?
Yeah.
So this is a really great example of the critique that we've had of the mandatory pesticide testing approach, where it doesn't get a differentiated testing regime for allowable, disallowable, you know, banned pesticides. It often sort of lumps everything into one big group. And regardless of whether we're trying to prevent people from using things they're not allowed, or we're trying to protect ourselves from like the sort of natural contamination that's in the environment, a lot of these things need to be addressed with a different testing system. And the sort of attempt to find one system that is going to protect everybody from everything is not realistic. And by sort of pretending that we're creating this situation where, like, now that we're testing for pesticides, everybody's safe from pesticides, you know, we see that right now is a falsehood. And our hope for the pesticide testing process was always that it would be a little bit more nuanced, and it would be able to sort of pick up some of these deficiencies in the current way we do it. Because I'm of the opinion that our current way to test for pesticides is mostly just a facade. And the real work of determining safety is not being done at all. And I think this is a really great example of that. And so I hope that one of the things we can do in the context of reevaluating the mandatory pesticide testing that went into place some months ago is to take a look in this moment and reflect on how we're going to come back and change those rules in the next few years to make it so that we're building a really efficient, effective, and useful system for keeping people safe, instead of just wanting to kind of performatively demonstrate that we're doing something. And there's a real big difference between that comprehensive testing ecosystem and pageantry that we're performing now.
And I'm sorry, I do want to comment on that too. To that end, I thought, and I don't remember, unfortunately, who said this during the testimony before the board this morning, but the point that this just stigmatized a whole area as if they are malfeasors, right? As if they're doing anything other than being kind of victims of the soil, which, to Micah's point, like all kinds of testing issues with that. And the way that they came in, you know, overnight, as if they were coming to confiscate evidence of of a crime, right? Instead of, it's just stuff that's been in the soil for 50 years. It's not going anywhere. And so for the people who didn't hear that, all the testimony this morning, I think that's a really important thing for our community also to understand, because if we're all, you know, ethical people and we are very interested, not if, but we are, you know, we want to prioritize public safety, but we also don't want to do it in this manner, because these people have now been brushed with a reputation that that at least because of this, they don't deserve. I can't speak for them for everything else, but they don't deserve it for this. So.
Can we talk a little bit about the sensitivity of the instrumentation? You know, again, we're talking about a standard that's arbitrarily set at 0.1, but, you know, 0.5, or sorry, 0.15, 0.17, 0.23, like, you know, are those, how accurate is that instrumentation? Is that sort of infallible? Is, you know, difference with the way samples are set up, with the way sampling is done, with the you know, plus or minus in the scientific methods? Can Amber or Nick, can you guys speak to the instrumentation side of that?
Just having read some of the literature about, you know, the analytical side of DDT, a lot of the testing that's been done in the past has been done on soil and water. And to make sort of a blanket statement, testing cannabis products is usually quite a bit more difficult than soil and especially water. So, you know, until we get the standards and run them on the instruments, we won't know exactly, you know, until we start spiking actual cannabis oil. But I mean, cannabis products are really chemically diverse, and that makes it difficult to discern minute traces of chemical residues. So I off the bat, I would say 0.1 is a pretty low limit of detection. 0.05, I think, is proposed in the rules, sort of implied as an LOD, and you know, that's half again lower. So I think these are going to be challenging benchmarks for the labs to meet.
Yeah, and the 0.05 is in the soil, which I thought was interesting that they're setting such a low number in the soil, because, you know, we're not assuming that the plant is going to uptake every bit of it in the soil. So that was a very confusing to me. And again, like, it's very tricky to be arguing like for more pesticides and things, and I don't think that's anybody's goal in this conversation. Like, nobody wants, you know, more pesticides in our products, but I think that we just have to be realistic about what's in the world and how to manage it effectively, and so we do have to have conversations about setting these limits, and I would hope that nobody feels like intimidated in these conversations to you know, speak to a higher limit without being like, we're not pro pesticide. Just to
I would like to add, I think, to Burl's question of like these numbers being reliable at that level. This is a conversation that I've been trying to have with as many people as possible, in that there is inherent uncertainty and a window of values around any number that comes out of a lab that may or may not be correct. And so, you know, it depends on the standards and the method that the WSDA lab is holding themselves to, which I've never seen any documentation of their SOPs or their quality control or their quality management system documents. I've never asked, to be honest, but so there is some inherent variability around those numbers. And when I see numbers in some of those files that were like 47 parts per billion, that's hard to get that 7-digit correct, just say, much less the 4-digit. So there's definitely some variability around that. You know, I think if you send any 2 samples to a lab, you're going to get a number that's close, but not exactly the same, just given all of the steps along the way that have uncertainty built into them. And there's ways to minimize that uncertainty, but you're never going to get to 0. It's scientifically impossible. So it's a conversation we need to be having as an industry about pesticides, about cannabinoid levels, about all kinds of numbers that come out of the lab, and what's acceptable and what can people expect for uncertainty windows.
I have a really quick question, Amber. I know I'm not the moderator, Burl, sorry, but personal curiosity. Because nobody else can test for this here in the state anyway, does that affect the ability of the WSDA to ensure that what their measurements are coming back are, you know, usually you go, okay, I want another test from another place to make sure that that test is accurate, and we can't do that, right? And so does that
Not with
actually
cannabis
affect
samples,
that?
no.
Yeah.
There's no confirmation testing possible.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
can't ship them out of state to a different lab somewhere. No, don't try that.
And typically in these situations, you'd want a confirmation test, right?
That's one of my biggest questions on this data is, did they run these samples twice? You know, can I see the quality control injections and calibration curves for that run? I mean, I have a lot of questions.
Yeah, well, we're going to keep pushing them on the transparency of their data, and hopefully that they are releasing that information, including to the depths where you can actually, you know, investigate where those numbers are coming from rather than just a certificate of analysis. But like you said, you know, the runs, the blanks, the standards, and where those numbers came out, and if they did, you know, their own confirmation testing. There was some implication that you know, stuff was testing particularly hot after they ran a round of hops or something like that. Can you speak a little bit to crossover contamination and whether that's, you know, a potential issue? Is that
If you have a
rare?
good method, you really shouldn't, but yeah. I mean, I think that I lost my train of thought. Go ahead, Nick.
Well, I mean, as part of their own quality controls, they should be investigating crossover contamination. There's multiple ways they could be accomplishing that, but you know, that's not something that they've so far released.
Oh, I remember what I was going to say. We have an automatic retest. If we get a positive pesticide hit, we automatically reprep that sample and run it again. So is that something they do? I don't know. It's not required, but that's what we have in our documentation, and that's what we do.
As private operators, we understand quite well the implications of a positive pesticide test result, and how this impacts people's lives and livelihoods. So I certainly would hope that, you know, WSDA and LCB also, you know, took a minute to think about what the downstream effects are of the results from their laboratory, before, you know, taking such, I mean, these are pretty extreme actions.
I appreciate that. We actually have one of the members of Walden Cannabis on here, Gene Haney. So Jill, if you can see Gene, and Gene, if you're out there, can you raise your hand so that Jill can see you, and maybe you can speak to your experience a little bit.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I mean, yeah, obviously this has been pretty devastating for us. One thing that I'd like to point out that I'm not sure everyone knows happened, but when this all dropped, we were told to cease pretty much all operations, and we have our grow out in Brewster, and we have a processing license in Everett. And so we ceased all operations. We stopped doing, we stopped selling, we stopped reaching out to customers. We'd respond. We stopped fulfilling orders and told everyone, you know, we have no idea what's going on right now, guys. And then the LCB clarified with us on Monday after doing a lot of our own research, which many of you may have seen. We posted as much as we could publicly after doing our own research, speaking with experts on the subject, and trying to keep our consumers informed, trying to keep our retailers as informed as best as possible. Speaking on the irresponsibility of these farms kind of voicing their opinion, the way this was handled, I feel like was just irresponsible on the part of the LCB. I'm not sure what we were really supposed to do. Were we not supposed to do our own research? We were given very, very little information. And all we were told was that there were samples taken from our farm that tested positive for DDE. It took us a lot of going back and forth before we got any information as to what those levels were. When we got those levels, we did our own research, we talked to experts, and we did the best that we could in providing what we could understand what was going on, because no understanding was given to us, which is what we're all here talking about today. It sounds like, and I think we can all be in agreement on that part, is that there really wasn't very much information other than what dropped on Thursday to the entire industry. Until today, basically, where we're still kind of waiting, right? Another thing that I wanted to clear up too is Walden Cannabis by no means wants to mimic the inner workings and corruption of the tobacco industry. By no means. We are asking to look at an analogy set by the EPA on the closest agricultural commodity that has been scientifically studied for inhalation. That's all we're asking for. And I want to make that clear, because it sounded like it may not have been. We are not asking to mimic the tobacco industry in any way. I think if anyone were to meet us, any of us face to face and talk with us, it would be pretty obvious that none of us look or smell like big tobacco. I don't really have much to say other than that. Thank you.
Thanks, Gene. I appreciate the response. I appreciate the responses we've been getting out of Walden. You guys have been open and transparent and straightforward with the industry. You're the forefront of this, although there are 18 different farms and licenses implicated. But everything I've heard, you guys are doing your best, and that's what everybody in this industry is trying to do. And so I appreciate the effort that you bring and the ethos of pesticide-free growing that Walden has always held. And I feel for you, man. This sucks. I feel for you. I feel for the employees. I feel for the community there.
Thank you, bro. But the thing is, to interrupt you real quick, I mean, right now this is affecting us, but as we're all talking, this is a ubiquitous issue. It's sure, right now there's a map outlined, and those are the licenses affected, but that doesn't speak to all the processors, right, that have sourced material from that area, and that doesn't address the ubiquitous issue of DDE in general across the state. Sure, it's us right now, but it might be you tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of mentioned that earlier. I think that this has much larger implications statewide, and that's why I think it's critical to get our preeminent labs up and running with LCB financial support to be able to test for these chemicals. And ultimately, if a different, separate test is required in order to protect public health, I think those funds should come from the government of Washington, given the cannabis tax dollars that have gone in and not come from industry. Industry didn't cause this problem. We're subject to previous generations of spray that happened, and this is effectively a statewide Superfund site for the spraying of DDT and its breakdown chemicals. And the cannabis industry is victims of that. And I think that there needs to be, a recognition of the, $500 million in tax revenue that goes into the state, and that this should not solely fall on cannabis companies that are struggling to make payroll. They keep their employees going that are doing without in order to provide excellent jobs and that the cannabis ethos of making good, healthy, safe products and treating their employees well. So I think it's critical that the state step in and provide funding to make sure that the public health is protected. Any other comments? I'm going to throw it open kind of to more questions from the folks that are here. But any other comments from our panel before we do that?
I actually have one. It's kind of a non sequitur, but it's fell out of my brain when I was talking before, and I found it again. To your point, Burl, about remediation being kind of a bad word, from a legal standpoint, remediation was prohibited because they didn't want to encourage people to use pesticides, right? They didn't want to have a get out of jail free dump pesticides all over everything and then remediate it. And so it's one of those rules or laws that is intended to stop behavior. It's not necessarily because remediated product is harmful to health, because, you know, based on the lab testing, not a scientist, right? If it falls within those action levels, it's not. And so when we're talking about remediation of a product that is contaminated because of nothing the licensee did, right? Then remediation might make more sense, because you're not discouraging anybody from anything when the DDE is just sitting there and has been sitting there. What you're doing is making that usable and protecting health. And so I kind of want to throw that out there, because remediation does have kind of a bad, you know, tinge to it. But if you reconceptualize it as something that is not appropriate because there's no behavior to prohibit, maybe it's a little different.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we should be testing shelf-ready products, and if the chemicals in there are under the action limit, then those products should be safe for consumption. So yeah, 100% agreed. If we can merge batches and get a result that is under the limit, then I think we should be able to do that. There is a whole lot of product that's implicated, most of which has already been consumed, frankly, because we're talking about last year's crop and previous year's crops. But I think we need to be testing the oil and the distillate that's been made from these products, and making sure that that's below the action limit. Any other comments from the panel? So, I think it's a good opportunity to talk about it as well. And I saw a couple of comments about a cannabis commission. So the Cannabis Alliance put forward and has done for about the last 6 years the idea of doing a cannabis commission to have an industry supportive research vehicle that can look into some of these issues, and particularly pesticides. It's still open right now, sort of backdoor available before the House and Senate right now in the Washington legislature. So, I think this is an opportunity for the industry to come together and say it's time we had our own research vehicle that could look into this stuff, that could do good science on this stuff, and be responsive to the needs of the industry. And so I encourage everybody to reach out to your legislator and say, hey, this is exactly the reason why, something like a cannabis commission would be set up. And it's an opportunity to resurrect that bill and bring it forward. So encourage people to reach out to their local legislator.
So, Burl, sorry, I just wanted to make sure that I was able to say this. So part of what is would be incredible in this particular situation if we had a commission is that, number one, it is housed within WSDA and is a quasi-governmental agency. So as the LCB was starting to do their investigation, the WSDA would be notified, which I know that they were, and so would the commission. And the commission could have notified the farmers, started working on behalf of them, starting to do their own research, starting to do their own investigations, and would have had that transparency and communication pipeline that we have severely had lacking in this particular situation, which has just compounded this problem to no end. So I just wanted to speak to that in terms of all the different kinds of values that it could have provided in this particular case.
Yeah. It's if we can't get it passed in this session, which I suspect we can't, it's an opportunity to sit down, reset, rework, engage with the industry, invite more people into the conversation and have a broader discussion and try again next year, because I think it's critical for this industry to have a commission that represents us, that's industry representative. So one good question that I saw in the chat just now was, what's to be done from a retail perspective about this? Like the communication, really was just about the implicated farms. It wasn't, nothing's really been said about the downstream oil and ultimately those products that are sitting on the shelves right now. The LCP has said that this is a licensee recall, so they've notified the licensees and they have a standard format on how that's done. This batch failed testing, and you need to go within your own logs in the CCRS and determine where any of these cannabis products ended up, contact those retailers and contact those processors and let them know that they've got a contaminated lot. For the retailers right now, and I'm not sure if Mitzi's still online, but is there a good recommendation for the proactive things that a retailer can do right now in order to protect themselves and make sure that they're not selling any products that are under administrative hold?
Well, I mean, from a legal standpoint, there's not really any liability, but from a more practical standpoint, it's about education. It's about being able to educate the customers about what misinformation has been created versus what is reality. And so, you kind of have to figure out how best to navigate that based on your customers, I think. But, education that DDE is ubiquitous, number one, and not used intentionally, number two, and, present in very low levels relatively, may help. But, it's tricky from an industry-wide standpoint, right? Because you don't want to say, well, that was those people. You don't want to say that, but you don't want to stigmatize all of Okanagan. You don't want to stigmatize Eastern Washington. You don't want to do any of that. And so, what we're talking about is outdoor agriculture, and it's inherently vulnerable to things that are out of the control of the people who are growing. And so that could be an apple or that could be cannabis. But what's on the shelves right now, we have no data that it's harmful at all. So I'm not saying it's not. I mean, specifically in cannabis and in the levels that's present, not in general. And so you got to find that message that hopefully will resonate with your customers.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think Mitzi's accurate in that, at the levels that we're talking about in the flower and not even knowing whether that's eliminated in the extraction or distillation process, it makes it difficult. You can reach out to the specific farms that are involved. Cannabis generally produced in this state is among the cleanest products that are available in the consumer, I'll say consumption chain, not food chain, but the cannabis manufacturers I know and the growers and producers that I know are fastidious about ensuring that no chemicals or pesticides touch their products or involved in the chain. So this is a very difficult time, I know, for a lot of companies. And so from a retail perspective, I just encourage you to, check on the licenses that are subject to an administrative hold. If you've got any products from those licenses, be sure that those products aren't subject to administrative hold. Be proactive on your end. It's difficult right now because there's so much misinformation and confusion going around to be absolutely sure, but really double check the products that you have available on their shelves and make sure they're not subject to an administrative hold. Sorry, I'm reading here from David. Amber mentioned she found an action limit of 0.2 ppm for combined DDT and breakdown byproduct analytes. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I don't know if Amber is still on. I think she had to jump. And so, yeah, I think Micah might have posted the FDA residual standard at 0.4 ppm. So, there's a couple of different standards that are being poked around out there. So I think, again, it's important to look to the science and follow the federal guidelines to the extent that we can, unless we've got some compelling science that's indicating that we should choose a different standard. I think by and large, the products that are out there on the shelves, as indicated, the tiny amounts that may be there do not necessarily raise any public health concerns. But each individual has got to make that decision for themselves. And so, again, education is always the primary importance here. And so we don't want to be involved in the misinformation industry that sort of surrounds this stuff. So it's important to edify yourself, go online, do some research, check that you can, and follow the science. So Caitlin, I think that you've got a couple of other questions queued up from folks, do you?
I do not. You've covered what you got. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else out there have any questions? We're kind of over our ordinary time limit, but there's, a lot of information to cover here. I really appreciate the panelists for joining and for their comments and expert opinions. I know that you guys have a lot of demands on you right now, so I appreciate you joining us. Lucas, I think, you've got your hand up. Jill, if you could unmute Lucas. Thanks.
Actually, Kurt wants to ask a question here.
Hey, everyone. My name's Kurt. I'm the president of Harmony Farms. First, thank you for the opportunity to, speak to all of you. Naturally, I think this is a very unfortunate situation for the industry. And, I think we're all hoping for a resolution that, damages the least amount of reputations. And, our sympathy goes out to the farms that have done nothing wrong, that are now, facing issues as a result of this. And I think I've heard some good points that have been raised, reviewing action levels, transparency from the LCB, double testing standards to do a confirmation test. I think all of those are valid, but what I haven't heard and what I think is truly the crux of the issue here is and I've known this, for years now, and I've fortunately, I don't know that too many people have been caught in this, but there is an inherent booby trap in the regulatory system that we have, which is if the WSDA is holding a standard that we are accountable to, which is 243 different analytes, and there is not access from an operational standpoint to hold ourselves accountable to that standard. And if I was to, go to every lab out there that I can legally send samples to, and they are only able to test, a portion of that, let's say maybe 150 if you spend money on a more expensive test, then there is just an inherent booby trap of 100 different, analytes that, are essentially 100 different boogeymen that can come out of nowhere. And today we're focused on this DDX, and what I'm, DDX as kind of Nick, termed. But what I'm concerned about is that we are nearsighted on this, and we say, okay, let's add a 5 analyte DDX panel to now the testing measures, and we reduce the booby trap from 100 analytes down to 95. That's not going to solve the issue because, who knows, somebody in Wenatchee, maybe there was a pesticide that was used out there. We're just essentially kicking this can down the road until there is a uniform standard between what the LCB and the WSDA is testing for and what the labs can test for. We're all just subject to, regardless of, how good your practices are, regardless of how stringent you are. I can tell you Harmony has a reputation of being one of the more high maintenance, operators when it comes to pesticide testing. And I know even when I'm spending as much money as I can, trying to make sure that our product is as clean as possible, that I'm inherently taking upon a liability, which is not knowing for sure, regardless of how many different tests I have, that show that we are in the clear and we have full, and complete confidence in the products meeting the standard that we are held to. So until, that is in place and we don't have this, discrepancy or this delta between what the regulators are saying we're accountable to and what we can hold ourselves accountable to, this issue is just going to persist. And so to me, that's the core of it. A lot of these other things are kind of like symptomatic. If we get double testing, confirmation tests, great. If we get more, sensible action levels, great. But none of that means anything unless we can actually meet the standard that is being put upon us. So.
Really good comment. And I kind of alluded to that a bit earlier, certainly something I've talked about before, but that's critical. As producers, we don't have access to the WSDA. If we want to ensure that our product is absolutely clean of those 243 different analytes that the WSDA tests for, there's no way for us to do that. It's not possible. We get the 57 analytes that are tested at the 502 labs. And you're right, there's about 200 different analytes for products we've never even heard of that could potentially be environmental contaminants in our cannabis. And
can I ask, just on this, can I ask Nick a question? Nick, what's the most comprehensive panel that you guys offer at Confidence, and how many analytes are on there? I want to say the most comprehensive test. Go ahead.
You're unmuted, Nick.
Yeah, so I mean, at our California lab, we do 66, so we can port that over to Washington in 66. If we felt that there was a demand for a 200 and some odd pesticide panel, then we would provide that. But we haven't seen interest in elevated numbers beyond what LCB mandates, and so that's why we don't offer that, because there wouldn't be an ROI in it for us.
Sure, and the reality is that it could very well become cost prohibitive if that test costs $400 a test because of all of the extra testing that you have to do. Now a operator's in the position of, do I ensure that I'm meeting the standard that I'm obligated to, or do I price myself out of the market and there's no point because my products can't compete?
Well, and in conversations with the LCB about exactly this, right, 2020, they are viewing it as, well, you're not in trouble if you test hot for something that you can't get a test for. Completely ignoring the fact, just from a business standpoint, that doesn't really matter when you're going to tell me I can't sell any of my products, right? I went around and around, and the conversation was also like, okay, if these are so important that you're going to destroy this person's entire year, why can't we test? Why don't you require that we test for them, right? You need to decide what is important, and you can't come back and say, well, now this one is, you're out of luck, and basically you're out of business. And that it just, they look at it from a criminal culpability lens. Like, well, we're just going to go ahead and do it, but we're not going to call you a bad guy. Well, that's not very helpful. And so that conversation has been occurring for years, and it seems like it's just kind of bouncing off of them because they're just looking at it from that standpoint. I don't know why.
Well, I think the opportunity here is that this booby trap that I speak of, it's if one operator gets caught in that periodically, it's probably more likely than not, nothing's going to change because there isn't enough of an outcry. Whereas, this may be the first opportunity to say that there's enough kind of bodies that have piled into this booby trap that maybe it's time for something to actually give,
I think that's a great point. I really do.
Yeah.
Yeah, the system has to be re-envisioned. The idea of the wait times that, there was a 8-month, 9-month backlog at WSDA at one point. what's the point of even testing anymore if you're an 8-month backlog? Apparently that's down to 4 or 5 months now, but still, completely unacceptable as far as protecting public health is concerned. And that double standard, like we've got no way of knowing, whether or not we're occasionally contaminated by environmental pathogens or chemicals that affect our cannabis. We've got no way of testing, so we need to re-envision that system. And this is definitely something we're going to engage with the LCB on in their rulemaking process to see if there's a way to change the way the system is. But ultimately, it's a catalyst for looking more to WSDA and Department of Ecology as the standards for determining what we're testing versus the LCB. And so that's a conversation and a process as well to get to that stage.
I want to chime in on that point and say that this again is really great reason for us to push legislatively for the WSDA to be the primary regulator of the cannabis production. That's something that we've been working on and talking about for many years, and I think this is yet another example of why that's necessary and important for us to push on in the legislative session next year. So this is because we're dealing with an agency that doesn't have the expertise or the orientation to making sure that the people that they're working with have the tools and resources they need to do the good work that we're trying to do. And it's just about their mindset of approaching it combatively. And we're not going to get away from that until we get a different regulatory agency with a little bit more understanding of the details of being an agricultural product and what that entails, because we need the support of the WSDA to get this stuff right. And there definitely is a better way to do this. The entire framework of testing, compliance, and assuring that we're safe, like the gentleman with Lucas was just talking about. This speaks to why we need to separate trying to prevent people from using things that are not supposed to versus the contamination that's inherent in our environment. And an entirely different approach needs to be used in those different circumstances. And the LCB just doesn't have the resources and capacity to create that framework. And so we're going to need to push for the WSDA to be our primary regulator on the production side of things. The LCB would still, maintain control of the distribution and the sales, but that is something that there's legislators that are very interested in supporting. The WSDA is moving in a direction where they're much more interested in taking on that responsibility. And so this is a great opportunity for us to demonstrate yet again why that's a really important thing for us all to work on next year.
Appreciate that, Mike. I agree with those sentiments. Any last comments? I think we're way over time, so we're going to start wrapping it up. You can always reach out to me directly as well, burl.bryson at the Cannabis Alliance, or email at thecannabisalliance.us. And we want to continue this conversation, communication, and work collaboratively towards or an effective resolution. So appreciate all your time. Any final comments?
I have one that is off topic. If that's
Okay.
all right. Just wanted to let everybody know arrest protection passed the Senate and is awaiting the governor's desk while we were talking this afternoon. So it's arrest protection for patients who are authorized.
And also the interstate commerce bill was passed by the House, going back to the Senate for reconciliation. So that's in final stages as well. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, panel members, for great insights for patients and for your time showing up here today. To everybody that joined, thank you. Appreciate you, and love out to the cannabis community.